Three numbers in a classified Pentagon assessment changed everything. I thought I knew about American power: 67%, $2.4 trillion, and 14 months. I never thought I'd witness the moment when a single economic analysis could expose the fundamental weakness of the entire Western military-industrial complex. But that moment arrived last week when intelligence sources shared what Pentagon economists have been quietly calculating for months. The developing fiscal crisis behind America's Ukraine commitments represents far more than a budget shortfall. It's an economic revelation that could reshape global power dynamics for the next century. Standing in my Chicago office, reviewing classified financial assessments that won't reach public discussion for years, I'm struck by how completely this crisis mirrors the great imperial overstretch collapses of history. We're watching the real-time bankruptcy of assumptions that have guided American defense spending since the Cold War's end. And most Americans still don't understand that their military supremacy just died of financial mathematics. What's unfolding in Washington's defense budgets isn't just another spending debate. It's the economic manifestation of a strategic delusion that has plagued American planners since 1991, the belief that unlimited military superiority can be sustained without unlimited economic resources. The refusal to acknowledge fiscal realities in defense spending reflects a broader refusal to acknowledge economic realities globally. Let me explain why this moment represents a turning point, not just for American military planning, but for the entire international economic system that finances global power projection. The situation developing around Pentagon budget projections reveals something that American strategists have consistently refused to acknowledge. The era of economically sustainable American military dominance is ending. For 30 years, U.S. defense spending operated on assumptions of economic growth and fiscal flexibility that no longer exist. Massive defense budgets, global military presence, technological superiority programs, all financed through debt accumulation that has now reached mathematical impossibility. The classified Pentagon economic analysis I've reviewed shows terrifying precision. Current military spending trajectories combined with existing fiscal obligations create what defense economists call a strategic insolvency cascade within 14 months. Here's what that means in practical terms. The Pentagon's classified financial models project that maintaining current global military commitments while funding next-generation weapon systems would require defense spending increases that exceed America's entire projected economic growth through 2030, not defense budget growth. Total economic growth. The mathematics are brutal and undeniable. America is trying to maintain global military dominance with an economy that can no longer support global military dominance. The Ukraine conflict exposed this contradiction with devastating clarity. Pentagon estimates show that replacing weapons sent to Ukraine, maintaining global readiness, and developing systems to counter peer competitors would cost $2.4 trillion over 5 years. That's more than America's entire current annual federal revenue. But here's a number that should terrify every American strategist: 67%. That's the percentage of current U.S. military advantages that Pentagon analysts classify as economically unsustainable at current funding levels. Advanced weapon systems that cost billions to develop and maintain. Global military bases that require massive ongoing investment. Training programs for technological superiority that demand constant financial resources. All financially impossible under realistic economic projections. The tactical details matter because they reveal broader systemic problems. Reports indicate that maintaining America's technological edge requires research and development spending growth rates that exceed GDP growth by factors of 3 to 5. That's mathematically impossible without massive debt accumulation or dramatic cuts to all other government functions. More significantly, the industrial dynamics of peer competition are exposing critical weaknesses in American defense economics. The Pentagon is discovering that matching Chinese military production capacity would require defense spending levels that would bankrupt the federal government within a decade. This isn't a temporary budget challenge. It's a structural problem that reflects fundamental changes in global economic competition, technological development costs, and the relative economic positions of great powers. China's defense spending, by contrast, operates within sustainable economic parameters. Their military modernization programs are funded through economic growth, not debt accumulation. While America optimizes military capabilities without economic constraints, China optimizes military development within economic reality. The strategic implications extend far beyond immediate defense budgets. Every intelligence agency in the world understands that economic sustainability determines long-term military power. Chinese strategic planners aren't just matching American military capabilities, they're doing it more cheaply and more sustainably. The classified Pentagon report reveals something even more alarming. American military superiority depends on allies who are experiencing the same fiscal constraints. NATO countries cannot increase defense spending to levels required for technological parity with peer competitors without triggering domestic political crises. The economic warfare dimensions of this shift are equally significant. The sanctions regimes that were supposed to demonstrate Western economic dominance have instead accelerated the development of alternative economic architectures that reduce global dependence on American financial systems. Countries that were previously dependent on American economic integration are now developing parallel systems that function independently of Western oversight. This shift has profound implications for America's ability to finance military dominance through global economic extraction. The broader pattern emerging suggests we're witnessing the transition from economically sustainable to economically impossible American hegemony, a transition that American policymakers have been avoiding but can no longer postpone. The assumption that American military superiority could be maintained indefinitely regardless of economic cost has prevented serious consideration of how to operate effectively within fiscal reality. China is watching these developments with particular interest. Beijing understands that sustainable military power requires sustainable economic foundations. Their military planning integrates economic constraints from the beginning, creating long-term advantages that American defense planning ignores. The economic dimensions of this shift are becoming apparent in defense procurement. Advanced weapon systems are taking longer to develop and costing more than projected, while peer competitors are developing comparable capabilities faster and cheaper. American defense contractors operate in economic environments that prioritize profit maximization over cost efficiency, creating systematic disadvantages against state-controlled competitors who optimize for strategic effectiveness rather than financial returns. European allies are beginning to understand that American security guarantees may not be economically sustainable. If the United States cannot maintain technological superiority without bankrupting itself, then American commitments become mathematically impossible. The challenge facing American strategy is adapting military ambitions to economic reality. The traditional approach of unlimited defense spending funded through debt accumulation is no longer mathematically possible. The key question is whether American leadership can adapt military strategy to economic constraints gracefully, or whether attempts to maintain absolute dominance will accelerate economic decline and strategic failure. The classified Pentagon analysis provides a preview of what great power decline looks like in the 21st century. It's not dramatic military defeats, but gradual economic exhaustion that makes military effectiveness impossible to sustain. The outcomes of current fiscal decisions will influence American strategic capabilities for decades. If defense spending continues on unsustainable trajectories, then eventual economic crisis will force dramatic military reductions under crisis conditions rather than planned strategic adjustments. This doesn't necessarily mean American decline is inevitable, but it does mean that American strategy must adapt to economic reality rather than ignoring fiscal constraints in favor of strategic ambitions. The unipolar moment when American preferences could be imposed through unlimited military spending is ending, and the next phase of international relations will require strategies based on economic sustainability rather than economic impossibility. The financial crisis developing around Pentagon budgets is significant not because it determines immediate military capabilities, but because it reveals economic trends that will shape American power for the remainder of this century. Understanding these economic constraints is essential for developing realistic strategies for American engagement with an increasingly competitive world where military superiority requires economic foundations that America may no longer possess. The choice facing American leadership is whether to acknowledge economic reality and adapt military strategy accordingly, or to continue pursuing defense spending based on assumptions about American economic capacity that no longer match fiscal mathematics. The costs of choosing incorrectly will be measured not just in military ineffectiveness, but in economic collapse, alliance abandonment, and domestic political instability. The moment of strategic economic revelation has arrived. How American leaders respond will determine whether the United States remains a great power within economic constraints or follows the path of previous empires that bankrupted themselves pursuing military dominance they could no longer afford? The answer to that question is being calculated in Pentagon budget offices, but it will be felt in American communities, allied capitals, and competitor planning rooms for generations to come. What terrifies me most about the classified Pentagon assessment isn't the immediate fiscal crisis. It's the recognition that America's military-industrial complex has become what economists call a rent-seeking death spiral, a system that extracts maximum resources while delivering diminishing strategic returns. I've spent 40 years analyzing economic bubbles across continents. The defense spending bubble follows the same mathematical patterns as every financial bubble in history: exponential cost growth, productivity decline, and reality denial until mathematics forces recognition. The numbers buried in Pentagon classified analysis tell a story that should shake every American strategist. Current weapons development costs are growing at 7% annually, while defense budgets grow at 2%. That gap compounds into strategic bankruptcy within a decade, regardless of political decisions. But here's the detail that keeps me awake. China's equivalent military capabilities cost 60 to 70% less to develop and maintain. Not because Chinese technology is inferior, but because their defense economics aren't captured by profit-maximizing private contractors operating without competitive pressure. The American F-35 program alone, $1.7 trillion over its lifetime, cost more than China's entire military modernization from 2000 to 2020. One weapons system versus 2 decades of comprehensive military transformation. The economic efficiency gap is staggering. 3 weeks after reviewing the classified Pentagon report, I received calls from contacts at defense contractors across the country. The same story everywhere. Internal projections showing current business models are unsustainable without massive government subsidy increases that exceed fiscal possibility. Lockheed Martin's classified analysis projects requiring 40% annual budget increases to maintain current development timelines. Raytheon's internal assessments show similar mathematical impossibilities. Boeing's defense division has quietly begun restructuring for what they call post-superiority economics. The European defense industry faces even worse economics. Maintaining technological parity with American systems while developing independent capabilities requires investment levels that would consume 15 to 20% of total European GDP growth annually. Those numbers simply don't work. Pentagon economists have developed what they call strategic insolvency scenarios, mathematical models showing when American military advantages become economically impossible to maintain. The median projection shows strategic insolvency beginning in 14 months, accelerating thereafter. This isn't theoretical economic modeling, it's operational planning for managed military decline versus chaotic military collapse. The classified assessment includes projections for what happens when defense spending reaches mathematical limits. Social program cuts trigger domestic unrest. Infrastructure investment collapses trigger economic competitiveness decline. Tax increases trigger capital flight and economic stagnation. Every pathway towards sustaining current military spending leads to economic conditions that make military spending irrelevant because the economy supporting it disintegrates. Meanwhile, China's defense spending operates within sustainable economic parameters designed for generational competition rather than quarterly profit maximization. Their long-term economic strategy treats military capability as investment in future economic security rather than consumption of current economic resources. The strategic revolution occurring isn't just military, it's economic warfare through competitive efficiency rather than resource extraction. China is defeating American military superiority by building equivalent capabilities more cheaply and sustainably. This represents a paradigm shift in how great power competition functions in the 21st century. Victory goes not to whoever spends most, but to whoever spends most efficiently while maintaining economic foundations for sustained competition. America's military-industrial complex was optimized for competition against the Soviet Union, a peer competitor with even worse economic efficiency, against China's state-directed capitalism optimized for long-term strategic effectiveness. American defense economics become systemically disadvantaged. The classified Pentagon report concludes that maintaining American military superiority would require either doubling current defense spending, economically impossible, or accepting strategic parity with China and Russia, politically impossible given current strategic commitments. This mathematical impossibility is driving the quiet policy shifts that most Americans haven't noticed yet. Gradual reduction in global commitments, increased reliance on allied military capabilities, strategic acceptance of spheres of influence previously considered unacceptable. The economic mathematics of military supremacy have shifted permanently. What took America decades of economic growth to build, peer competitors can now match through efficient resource allocation and strategic focus. The moment of American military economic supremacy is ending not through military defeat, but through economic evolution that makes supremacy mathematically unsustainable.